Story 1. I would support mandatory retirement at a specific age, perhaps 70. If a lawmaker reaches that age during an active term, they must step down when the next round of elections begins. Story 2. I live in a state with term limits for the legislature. For every problem the limits solve, they create a new one. In the end, it is different, not really better. Story 3. Ultimately, term limits would only lead to a rotation of lobbyists filling roles. Elections serve as the true constraint. Story 4. People should not be untouchable once appointed. There must be a mechanism for society to decide when they are no longer fit for the job. Story 5. Congressional term limits are an idea that sounds good at first glance but ignores the underlying reasons we might want them and the problems they would create. If you do not want a member of Congress to serve more than a set number of terms, vote them out after that number. If an elected official is doing a good job, they should be allowed to continue serving. The problems we need to address are that members of Congress can profit from their positions of power through insider trading, kickbacks, golden parachutes, lobbying deals, and unlimited dark money donations and political action committees. Term limits do not solve any of those problems. Story 6. Term limits? Please. Half of these people would need a global positioning system, a map, and divine intervention to find the exit. At this point, I support installing rotating doors in Congress and letting fate decide who gets kicked out next. Story 7. Do you realize that the Supreme Court is not part of Congress? Story 8. I think there should be term limits for every government official, Congress, the Supreme Court, the President, or any other office. No one should be able to hold their position indefinitely. Story 9. I do not like term limits for legislators. I think that is the public's job, and the public should be allowed to keep whoever they want representing them or not. Story 10. I think we desperately need age limits for these roles. The average age of members of Congress keeps going up, and the country is becoming increasingly beholden to the elderly. Story 11. I say 10-year congressional term limits and mandatory retirement at age 65. Story 12. The one drawback of term limits is that members will not have real power. The reason West Virginia has some Federal Bureau of Investigation facilities and other benefits is because Senator Byrd was one of the longest-serving senators in history. Term limits could allow staffers to be in charge instead of the elected representative. I propose mandatory retirement at age 70. But officials may finish their current term. Story 13. I am skeptical of a system with no veteran politicians and many veteran lobbyists. Story 14. When you have term limits, the most experienced people become lobbyists. I am not sure what this accomplishes. Judges do not have terms and do not face election. It is not even close to the same situation. Story 15. Yes. A 12-year term limit for Congress and a 12-year ban on becoming a lobbyist if voted out or upon retirement. Members of the Supreme Court of the United States would serve 20-year terms and then step down. Story 16. An 18-year term would extend well beyond presidential terms and 3 Senate terms. It would provide independence and time to build a record of cases while avoiding the inertia of a lifetime appointment. Story 17. 10 terms in the House of Representatives. For terms in the Senate, everyone can serve a 20-year career and then leave. Story 18. It would take a constitutional amendment. It is never going to happen. Story 19. I am 50. I already feel like I am too out of touch despite my best efforts to fully grasp the challenges of people in their 20s. 65 is plenty old enough. Story 20. Although term limits could be helpful, they will not solve the problem of legal bribery through donations to campaigns, political action committees, and political libraries. Story 21. I think the problem is money in politics, not a lack of term limits. Story 22. All elected officials and appointees should have term limits and age limits. There should also be limits on investment income for elected positions. Too many become excessively wealthy by accessing data the public does not. I do not know why this is not considered insider trading. They should also be on Medicaid and Medicare so they do not lose touch with the rest of us. Story 23. Every public office should have both term and age limits. Story 24. We have term limits for the president for a reason. It is reasonable to seek term limits for representatives and senators as well, and it is obscene that they receive generous pensions and benefits for such short service. Term limits for justices are more problematic. Lifetime appointments have issues, and shorter terms could cause the Supreme Court to swing between the left and the right every few years. Story 25. I think it's idiotic to consider this government capable of amending the Constitution. Story 26. Term limits are the least of my worries. I would rather see rules for ethics and for upholding the Constitution, with consequences such as fast-track impeachment of judges who do not. Story 27. I do not think term limits are the issue. Politics is a skill like any other. If you were, for example, going under the knife, who would you want operating on you? The surgeon with 20 years experience, or the person with 2 years experience who will reach mandatory retirement in a couple of years? There are many problems with Congress. Lobbying, the lack of a mandatory retirement age, no meaningful checks against insider trading and self-enrichment, and the fact that the job is highly lucrative. I do not think term limits would solve these problems, and they would create a host of new problems as well. Story 28. I do not think that is a good idea for the Supreme Court, but I do support it for Congress. I also think there should be a rule that no one over the age of 70 may hold any position of authority in the government. Story 29. I do not think it should be term limits, it should be age limits. A person's last active term should be at age 65, with automatic retirement at 70. Enough of these people who do not even know how the internet works determining the country's laws. Story 30. Age limits are a better solution. Term limits are inherently anti-democratic for a representative body and would create more corruption than they would solve. Story 31. A single representative or senator does not have nearly the same power as the president or a Supreme Court justice, so the problem is less urgent. Mandatory term limits would produce a Congress full of inexperienced members who lack institutional knowledge and established working relationships. What is needed is campaign finance reform to level the playing field between incumbents and newcomers with new ideas. Story 32. There should be a retirement age for all politicians. Story 33. Additionally, stop the salary of Congress during a government shutdown. Story 34. Term limits on everything. Why don't we have this already? Presidents are limited. Why wouldn't other positions be? Story 35. He's trying to remain relevant and hopes no one looks into Operation Fast and Furious or the death of Agent Brian Terry. Story 36. Holder. Somehow this is not in the top 200 dumbest things this idiot has suggested. Story 37. The Supreme Court and Congress are separate branches of government. Any term limits for either would require a constitutional amendment, as was done for the office of the president. I support congressional term limits. For example, 2 terms for senators and 6 terms for members of the House. For the Supreme Court, I prefer an age limit rather than term limits, because justices serve for life unless they retire. Term limits for lifetime appointees would therefore seem impractical. Story 38. Agreed. Add age limits. Nobody should serve on the Supreme Court or be president after age 75. Story 39. I am against term limits. I want my doctor, my lawyer, or the pilot of the plane I am on to be experienced and to know what they are doing. However, I wish voters would do a better job of imposing term limits at the polls by voting out ineffective officials. I moved to Kentucky 40 years ago at age 18, and Mitch McConnell was one of our senators then. He should have been out of politics before I turned 30. Story 40. I could accept 10-year appointments with age limits. I would prefer they be nominated by judges rather than by the President of the United States, but that will never happen. Story 41. I imagine this suggestion is because it is against his personal political stance. If it is not, then it is worth exploring. Story 42. I suggest mandatory retirement ages similar to those in place for other government positions, such as air traffic controllers. Story 43. Every elected office should have term limits, and it is laughable that they do not. Life appointments are for royalty, not for democracy. Story 44. The president serves 1 6-year term. No campaigning for a second term is allowed. All federal elected officials are eligible for recall. Story 45. I think there should be an age limit for all public offices, not a term limit. Let's say 70 years old. Story 46. I would prefer an age limit. It would still allow long tenure but make it possible to replace people with newer generations who better understand emerging technologies. Story 47. It would make the process inconsistent and very political, so not many changes. Story 48. From my perspective, term limits are a good thing. Having an elected official hold the same office for decades and begin to think it is their God-given right is, sadly, all too common. Story 49. No one over 65 should be allowed in government. They do not have to live with the long-term consequences of their actions. Story 50. I'd rather have age limits on the Supreme Court. Serve until 70, then retire. Story 51. We have term lengths for Congress. They occur every 2 years for the House and every 6 years for the Senate. Story 52. It will not pass as long as the Trump-aligned Congress is making millions from us. Story 53. Congress. I do not really care about term limits. There are elections every 2 years. The Supreme Court, as we have seen recently, should not be a lifetime appointment. I understand the reasoning that lifetime tenure gives justices job security so they cannot be bought, but it has backfired. Because they cannot be removed, they can act as if they are 100% for sale. I like the idea of long terms for justices, but I am concerned that a president could stack the court in their favor. I do not have a good solution for that. Story 54. I think it's past time to add age restrictions for public office. Story 55. Not only do we need term limits, but we also need age limits. We do not allow younger people to run because of inexperience, so we should not allow older people to serve either. I am tired of these dinosaurs voting on things they do not understand or will not be around long enough to see the consequences. Story 56. I do not think congressional term limits are as straightforwardly beneficial as proponents claim. Lack of limits can absolutely serve the craven and the corrupt. But limits also allow good public servants to learn the ins and outs of governance and become highly effective. Likewise, forcing justices off the bench can impede the development and honing of judicial judgment. Yet lifetime appointments have enabled significant, undisguised corruption. Finite but renewable terms for Supreme Court justices would allow them to gain experience while providing a mechanism to remove self-serving or corrupt justices who substitute personal prejudices for the Constitution. Story 57. I do not know what kind of person seeks a job that is not a career. Ideally, we could attract many intelligent idealists, but in reality we would get ladder climbers who are always gunning for the next rung in government or a position as a lobbyist. The predictable response from most Redditors would be, how is that worse than now? The fact is we have a number of dedicated public servants in Congress. We need more, but we will not get them by simply kicking people out. The best way to remove poor actors in Congress is to advocate for a more democratic process, not less. Story 58. Yes, 100%. They should not serve for 30 years. Every part of government should have term limits, including the House of Representatives and the Senate. Story 59. I agree with term limits for the Supreme Court of the United States, or at least rotating justices in and out. I do not agree with term limits for Congress. What I do support for Congress is mandatory ranked choice voting for all federal offices, publicly funded elections, and strict limits on lobbying and campaign finance. Story 60. It has been tried before and it did not work. Read the history. I do not want the Supreme Court of the United States justices to have term limits. The whole point of not having term limits is to prevent them from being pressured by external forces. When they do not have to worry about keeping their jobs and know they will serve for the rest of their lives, they can become immune to outside pressures. Is it perfect? No. But every other option is worse to some degree, so I will accept what we have until someone can suggest a better idea. Story 61. There needs to be a limit and an age cap. If you reach the age cap partway through a term, you are ineligible. Story 62. In Pennsylvania, we hold retention votes for our state Supreme Court. After 10 years of service, everyone in the state votes to either retain a justice or not. There was a retention vote last month. I have long thought this could work well at the national level. Story 63. I am in favor of them, but I think the terms need to be lengthy, for example, 10 years, and should be staggered so that multiple seats on the bench are not open for replacement at the same time except in unusual circumstances. Justices who are seen as generally fair to both sides of the aisle could be reappointed for another term even if the dominant party has changed. And if that does not work out, then at least highly partisan justices would not remain a problem for multiple generations. Story 64. I am guessing that, at a minimum, you will have an 80% pro-term limit. Story 65. Congress needs to survive elections, so it's far less important. Story 66. A practical option is a pool of justices who, once nominated, can be assigned to cases outside the federal system. They serve a term and then return to the federal bench unless needed. Story 67. Expand the court and require a retirement age instead of term limits. Implement an actual, enforceable code of conduct with very severe consequences. This is the only federal court that lacks a firm, enforceable code of conduct. Currently, it is treated as a suggestion, and violations result at most in a stern look or a strongly worded letter. Story 68. Yes. 60. Force them out before the actual retirement age. Story 69. All government positions should have term limits, including the Supreme Court. There should also be a vetting process and minimum qualifications for serving. Story 70. Implement term limits for all elected positions so no one holds a lifetime office. Story 71. There should be mandatory retirement at 67 for judges and elected officials. Individuals should be limited to 30 years of elected office in their lifetime. Story 72. If term limits would help prevent the widespread corruption now present in government and the Supreme Court, then we should adopt term limits for that reason alone. Story 73. Term limits and minimum and maximum age limits for all positions in the federal government. Story 74. Age limits and term limits for legislative members. There should be a standard mandatory federal retirement age, with an exception allowing Congress to recall retired members to service in an emergency. Story 75. People who would vote on term limits are the ones affected by them, so no. Story 76. Mandatory retirement at 60. 70 is many generations too old. Term limits every 25 years. No person 25 years and older should suffer under even one generational gap in the ruling class. Story 77. I do not think it is magically going to fix things the way people think it will. Story 78. There should be term limits for all high-level public offices. Limits should apply starting at the municipal level, including serving on a municipal council, being appointed or elected as a judge, or serving as a sheriff. The same should apply at provincial, state, and federal levels. This applies to any position that creates laws or heads a body that enforces or interprets laws. There should be 3 lifetime limits. The first is a limit on consecutive years in office, for example, 8 years. The second is a limit on years in elected positions at the same level, municipal, provincial, or federal, for example, 12 years. Finally, a total lifetime limit for any such positions, for example, 15 years. For example, someone who serves 5 years on a municipal council would have 10 years of public office remaining. They could then serve 8 years as a federal representative, 2 terms, and would have 2 years left to serve elsewhere. This would require adjustments and resolving edge cases. Story 79. I am okay with term limits, but they should be longer than many people think. I would set a limit of 3 terms for senators, totaling 18 years, and 9 terms for House representatives, also totaling 18 years. I do not want to empower lobbyists by making terms extremely short. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has served in Congress for 6 years, and I would not be happy if she were forced out by term limits anytime soon. I would allow the president to appoint a Supreme Court justice every 2 years, with each appointment serving an 18-year term. If a seat is vacated, a replacement would fill the remainder of that 18-year term. I think age caps are more important. No one should be able to serve past the age of 75. Story 80. You should not be allowed to run for office if you would be older than 65 by the end of your term. If you win and turn 65, you are not eligible for re-election even if you are not otherwise term limited. A clear and uniform recall process for all elected officials should be in place. allowing a recall election with a two-thirds vote threshold for early removal of those who abandon their positions. Kyrsten Sinema is a prior example. John Fetterman is a more recent one. People will be divided on a recall process for members of Congress, and it will echo many of the same arguments against term limits, but we need to be serious about the damage these officials can do in the absence of a recall process. Story 81. Those limits already exist. No member of Congress may serve more than 2 years in the House or 6 years in the Senate without being re-elected. If you want to institute a maximum age, I am for it, but you will likely be called ageist for suggesting it. Story 82. Generally speaking, you should not be able to preside over laws that will affect a world you will not be around to see. Story 83. I support congressional term limits. Each member of Congress can serve a maximum of 2 terms. Story 84. He wouldn't be saying that if the court had ruled the other way. Leave the Constitution alone, you sore losers. Story 85. Term limits for undemocratically appointed positions are pro-democracy. Term limits for democratically elected positions are undemocratic. Story 86. Honestly, term limits seem fair. Too many politicians stay in office for decades and lose touch with everyday people. Limits could force new ideas and make Congress less about career politics. Story 87. My thoughts on congressional term limits. 1. They are needed. 2. In each chamber there should be a consistent number of years. I prefer a 12-year limit, 2 Senate terms and 6 House terms. I could be convinced of 3 Senate terms, 18 years, and 9 House terms. 3. These limits should be coupled with age limits. If you will turn 75 by the time you would be inaugurated, you may not run for any office. That means a 74-year-old senator could serve until 80. That seems acceptable to me because many people remain mentally and physically functional at 80. I would not describe most people as nearly as functional at 85. 4. The same requirement as in point 3 should apply to presidential candidates. 5. Supreme Court justices must retire at an appropriate time during the year they turn 80. There is no option to continue beyond that unless they choose to retire earlier. We have a problem, in business as well but especially in politics, of older leaders running things longer than they should. I understand that a person who is 70 today is often healthier and more capable than a person who was 70 in 1980. The problem is not that experience is bad. Experience and knowledge are useful. However, older, staid attitudes do not reflect where the majority of the country is, and there are not good opportunities for younger people to gain the requisite knowledge. When vibrant young minds are tamped down, pushed aside, or told to wait their turn, they become resentful and tune out. Do you agree? Story 88. I don't believe in congressional term limits for 2 reasons. First, effective leaders should lead no matter how long they have been in office. Second, and more important, voters put people into office. If someone is not doing the job, you vote them out. We have an amazing ability in this country to grab our pitchforks and cast blame, but we are not good at aiming them in the right direction. We make the decisions, so why not focus on us? Story 89. People will say on a poll that they support term limits, but they do not vote that way in primaries. Story 90. Congressional term limits apply to Congress, which is part of the legislative branch of government. Supreme Court justices are members of the judicial branch and would be subject to judicial term limits. I support term limits for both Congress and the Supreme Court, but experience is important. I would prefer age limits or proof of cognitive fitness. Story 91. I generally agree with the principle that lifetime appointments insulate the judiciary from political pressures, but I am against them. Story 92. Ruth Bader Ginsburg's remaining on the court through Obama's second term was the reason Trump got a Supreme Court pick. Story 93. In favor. Term limits have the potential to reduce grift, corruption, and gridlock. Story 94. Impose term limits on Congress and the courts, and institute a mandatory retirement age. Enough with the gerontocracy already. If medical advances continue to improve the quality of later life and overall longevity without policy changes, we will soon be living out the plot of Vampire the Masquerade. Story 95. Congressional term limits are not what people might expect. When they occur, the staff who run congressional offices often come to hold the real power. They can persist from one politician to another and are unelected. Story 96. He would not be suggesting that the Supreme Court is weighted to the left. Story 97. Benefits should begin when regular working people can start claiming 100% of Social Security. Keep policies relevant to the current generation instead of being run by a previous generation that is out of touch with reality. Story 98. I cannot open external links or images. Please paste the text from those images or upload the images here and I will correct spelling, expand acronyms, remove repetition and special characters, fix punctuation, and return a clean version suitable for Azure text-to-speech. Story 99. I support limiting service on Capitol Hill to a maximum of 18 years combined in the House of Representatives and the Senate. That equals 3 6-year Senate terms or 9 2-year House terms, or any combination that totals 18 years. If you cannot accomplish your goals within 18 years, it is time for someone new. Story 100. Why are you backing off on Supreme Court limits? This is probably more important. Story 101. I want to circle back to Supreme Court term limits because that is something that absolutely should have happened yesterday. Story 102. We need to implement a system that allows voters to recall members of Congress. Primaries should not be the only mechanism for removing officials who have abused their power. Story 103. They could be on the federal bench for life, but they should serve rotating assignments on the Supreme Court of the United States. Story 104. Term limits are needed. The Constitution was written when people rarely lived to 95. It is inconsistent to be a strict textualist in every case while picking and choosing when to interpret the Constitution more flexibly. The whole document needs an overhaul now that we have seen its flaws exploited in ways no one could have predicted. For example, the Constitution should explicitly state that the president cannot pardon themselves, that the president is not above the law, that the president cannot accept bribes, whether in the form of money or gifts, personally or through any associated organization, that states cannot gerrymander districts for partisan gain, and that the Electoral College should be abolished. Story 105. I am not American, but it seems like the system there is a bit dumb. Oh, here come the downvotes. Laughing out loud. Story 106. The House of Representatives is meant to provide practical representation and has short terms, so I do not think an age limit is necessary. I would set a 72-year age limit for the Senate and the presidency. 78 years is the average life expectancy in the United States, which supports limiting total tenure to the typical lifespan. The average tenure for the House of Representatives and the Senate is 8.9 years and 11.2 years, respectively. Increasing the average by 50% yields roughly 14 years for the House and 18 years for the Senate. 14 years equals 7 House terms, and 18 years equals 3 Senate terms. Story 107. They should all be termed. I get the argument of institutional knowledge, but look where that's gotten us. Story 108. Congressional term limits? Hell yes, 2 terms in the Senate, 4 in the House. Story 109. I would argue for 18-year terms with terms expiring every 2 years. If the Senate cannot agree with the president by the end of the session, then the appellate court judges select one of their own. Story 110. 5 terms for the Senate, 15 for the House. 30 years and out for each. If you want to be a career politician, fine. You still have plenty of time before you have to retire. Story 111. Eric Holder does not know his ass from a hole in the ground. Story 112. Term limits for everyone. No one should serve for life. No stock trading. If elected officials want to invest, investments must be limited to a single fund that will be independently managed and tied to the economic well-being of the average American, not solely to the stock market. No jobs with lobbyists after leaving office. Public servants cannot profit from their service. Compensation should be sufficient to reduce vulnerability to bribery. Repeal Citizens United. Address the composition of the Supreme Court. It should mirror the population in age, gender, and ethnicity. Currently lacks sufficient diversity and does not reflect the nation. Story 113. I want to overhaul it all. Presidents serve 6 years, for 1 term, and are ineligible for elected office thereafter. No person aged 65 or older may run for president. Representatives serve 4 years, with a maximum of 2 terms. There is no midterm shuffle. Every 2 years, all representatives are either running for re-election or leaving office. They may run for the Senate or for president. No person 55 or older may run for the House of Representatives. Senators serve 8 years with a maximum of 2 terms. They may run for the House of Representatives or for president. No person 60 or older may run for the Senate. Supreme Court justices serve 20-year terms. Terms are staggered with one appointment every 2 years. Appointments must be considered within 30 days by the full Senate and are approved by a supermajority. The first 2 years are training. Justices do not vote during that period. They hear every case and also sit on an appellate court in a different jurisdiction each year. The final 2 years are emeritus status. Emeritus justices may be called on to vote if a justice is absent or recuses themselves. After their Supreme Court appointment ends, justices return to the appellate court or may retire from service. No law may apply only to sitting members of the bench or to any elected or appointed position, nor may any law exclude such persons from exercising their rights. Every person holding an elected position and all justices must place all assets into a blind trust to be held in common with a Social Security fund during their tenure. Candidates may not keep or maintain campaign funds. All leftover funds are donated to the public good. Campaign funding is a public good, and each candidate must rely only on those public funds for their entire campaign. Campaign amounts are set by a nonpartisan committee. The method of appointment is to be determined. In the event of a government shutdown, every elected official forfeits eligibility to run for office again. In the event of an unbalanced budget, all elected officials forfeit their stake in the blind trust and their eligibility for future office. Lobbyists are prohibited from influencing government. Money and influence are not speech. Story 114. I support term limits for Congress and the Supreme Court of the United States. 2 terms for senators, 4 terms for members of the House of Representatives, and 10 years for Supreme Court justices. The Founding Fathers stated that serving in government was not intended to be a career. Public service was a patriotic duty after which officials would return to their prior occupations without pensions, retirement benefits, or lifetime privileges. Story 115. It would not solve anything. We need a more robust primary system that is independent of party apparatus and voters who actually participate in the primaries. Many of these problems would be solved by a more engaged populace and by preventing parties from using establishment support to suppress primary challengers. Story 116. I support fixed career term limits for the United States Congress. 1 for the House of Representatives, 1 for the United States Senate, and a shorter combined limit for serving in both. I also support mandatory, objective mental acuity examinations before appearing on the ballot and before being sworn in, after periods of incapacitation, and on a scheduled basis for people over 70. Story 117. Eric Holder is a piece of shit. But all politicians should be subject to term limits in every position. Story 118. This was long overdue. It should have been done decades ago when the libertarians first suggested it. Story 119. I am in favor of term limits for Supreme Court justices. Limit each justice to 2 terms. Story 120. We need it. Part of the reason Congress can be stuck is that some people can serve so long that they no longer reflect the people they represent. When incumbents are that long tenured, anyone who does reflect current views faces an uphill battle to win. Case in point, on a smaller scale, where I live, the mayor is almost always a Democrat. The last Republican mayor served in the 1960s. One mayor won 4 terms, the next won 3 terms, and the following won 5 terms. The last of those ran as an independent, after refusing to debate his opponent and losing the official Democratic nomination. He resigned with about a year left, and an interim mayor served the remainder. The most recent election was the first time the previous mayor had not run and won since 2005. In the last 50 years, my city has had only 5 mayors, and 2 of them served a combined 33 years. Now consider that the current longest-serving member of Congress has been in the Senate for 44 years, not counting 6 years he also spent in the House of Representatives. He is still 7 years short of the Senate tenure record. If that same tenure were applied to the House of Representatives, he would be 15 years short of the House record. Story 121. Yes, one 18-year term. I'd be fine with a 20-year term as well. Some political analysts did the math and figured that if you had 18-year terms, every president would get to select one. Story 122. I like justices having terms long enough that they are not constantly recycled with presidents, maybe 10 years or so. However, the limiting factor should be a yearly cognitive test or neurological exam instead of an arbitrary age. I do not care if a justice is 100 years old, as long as their mind works. Story 123. The Supreme Court should be a collection of appellate judges. A randomly selected group would choose which cases to hear, and a separate group, unknown to the first, would decide them. Problem solved. Story 124. Every day, the American government looks like an episode written by Seth MacFarlane. Story 125. All political offices should have term limits, especially those with ultimate authority. Story 126. Yes. Term limits for all branches. No more than 8 years. Story 127. Any political position, whether executive, judicial, or legislative, should be limited to 2 terms. If an official has reached retirement age, they should step down and pass the role to someone younger and more attuned to current times. Allowing officials who are inattentive to remain in these positions would result in dismissal in most other workplaces. Story 128. I do not think Congress needs term limits. They must stand for re-election periodically, and if they are unpopular, voters should remove them at the end of their terms. Incumbency is a huge problem in our country, but it has more to do with how people vote and the limited options created by the strength of the political parties. Term limits would mostly create a larger revolving door of people loyal to the parties who have less time to accomplish what they personally believe in. I do, however, believe Congress should have a maximum age limit. My idea is that if you are as old as or older than the average life expectancy for a United States adult, you cannot run for re-election. Tie the congressional age limit to public health so that Congress has extra incentive to improve the nation's healthcare. Regarding the Supreme Court, I am not sure about fixed terms. In theory, the court should be above the politics of re-election, and a revolving door of Supreme Court justices could lead to critical laws being reinterpreted so often that the rule of law feels less stable. I do not think we need term limits for Supreme Court justices if we can root out corruption in the court. I would prefer stronger congressional oversight that can punish justices who engage in actions that compromise their objectivity or promote personal interests. If we can keep the court honest, term limits are unnecessary. Story 129. Term limits should exist for all elected positions and their political appointees. Story 130. Repeal the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929 and the 17th Amendment. Return to population-based representation. Story 131. Yes. At a minimum, there should be repercussions for ethics violations. Goodbye. Thomas and Alito. Story 132. It is a terrible idea. Support an age limit, financial reforms including limits on the ability to quash primaries, and a ban on moving into lobbying or well-paid private sector positions. Term limits offer almost no benefit and have many downsides. Story 133. Are you asking about congressional term limits or term limits for the Supreme Court of the United States? Story 134. Fuck yeah. But within reason. Establishment politicians and justices are a problem. If one is corrupted, they can serve years in office. More than anything, I would say age. You just cannot be past 70 and decide the lives of 65% of other people when you are likely out of touch with them. Story 135. Term limits on the Supreme Court make sense. Congressional term limits will not fix what is wrong and could actually make it worse. Story 136. Terrible idea. Corrupt politicians are a dime a dozen. Incorruptible ones are not so common. This simply creates more opportunities to lose good people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and have them replaced by Republicans. Story 137. There are term limits, 2 and 6 years. Then they have to get re-elected. The people could remove them if they wanted to. That's on us. I understand the benefits of incumbency, But that's the way she goes, boys. Story 138. He has no right to discuss it when Trump seeks a third term in violation of the law. Story 139. After 4 years, you can never hold public office again. Story 140. I prefer moving to electoral systems that encourage better candidates from the start. The House of Representatives would improve tremendously if it had significantly more members and were set up as a mixed-member proportional representation system. Story 141. California has term limits for its state legislature. This means legislators must begin planning a game of musical chairs to move between elected offices and lobbying positions as soon as they take office. Story 142. At this point, I would love congressional term limits. Far too many of these people treat politics like a retirement plan. You should not be in your 80s making decisions about technology, climate, or social issues you do not even understand anymore. Story 143. Term limits, or more accurately fixed-length terms for the Supreme Court, make sense because justices are appointed rather than elected. Term limits do not necessarily make sense for Congress, since members are elected and voters can remove them. A relatively high retirement age might work instead. The problem is 90-year-old, barely mobile representatives who are merely carted around in the name of representing us and who may not have the capacity to serve effectively. If you want to serve in Congress for 40 years, be first elected in your 20s, not in your 50s. Story 144. Not constitutional without an amendment. You would think someone who claims to have a law degree would know this. Story 145. Why would I want Bernie Sanders forced out over his age? That is my main counterargument. Story 146. Is this after they refused to consider same-sex marriage? Very telling if it is. Story 147. I do not understand how congressional term limits will change anything. How would they prevent someone from being corrupt? Story 148. If term limits are good for the president, then I think they are good for every elected official and far better than lifetime appointments for anyone in government. Story 149. I like this idea, although you would need a constitutional amendment. Everyone gets 12 years. 6 terms in the House of Representatives, 2 Senate terms, and 3 presidential terms. Story 150. They must be made retroactive for every sitting justice. Story 151. Yes, the Supreme Court of the United States should have mandatory retirement at age 65. With elected officials, I'm conflicted. On one hand, it would allow removal of career politicians who do not want or cannot do anything else. On the other hand, if voters keep electing them, the voters chose them. Story 152. Term limits could really help refresh the system. Too many people stay in power for decades and forget what real life outside Washington looks like. Story 153. The Supreme Court is reviewed and reconfirmed every 5 years, but this is only an ethics review. Cannot be done because you dislike the court's decisions. For instance, Justice Clarence Thomas could be removed for accepting bribes, but Justice Neil Gorsuch could not be removed simply because people disagree with his decisions. For term limits in Congress, I would say you can serve 3 terms in the Senate or 9 terms in the House, or a combined total of 20 years if you switch between the two. Story 154. He should shut the fuck up after killing the best rapper of our generation. Story 155. I think it is a ridiculous waste of time to talk about things that would require a constitutional amendment. Story 156. People should not run for political office after age 70 and should serve as advisors instead. Story 157. A lifetime appointment seems silly when you know that at least 3 of them are corrupt. Story 158. The simplest solution is to expand the Supreme Court to 13 justices and require justices to rotate to the circuit courts after a set number of years from appointment. This avoids the need for a constitutional amendment and promotes more balanced future decisions. Term limits for members of Congress are a separate issue. What we actually need is an age limit, but that would require a constitutional amendment. Story 159. There should be term limits for every position of power in this country. All offices should be limited to 2 terms. The United States Congress should be an exception and limited to 8 years total, served as 4-year terms. Story 160. I think they are needed, but we also need to make massive changes to campaign finance and lobbying. If we are going to impose term limits or some other restriction on how long someone can serve, that would also mean we need a more robust infrastructure to preserve institutional knowledge and experience, and even more safeguards against lobbyists and special interest groups that will not have the same rotation of people in planning. Those problems are not an excuse to do nothing. An imperfect solution is not an excuse to give up on fixing a problem. Story 161. Lifetime appointments for any position of power were a bad idea from the start. They definitely have not gotten any better in the age of Trumpism. Story 162. I just do not understand. That applies to every country. Why would we entrust the future of the world to people who are out of touch and old? I truly do not think any government position should be held by people older than 65. Many older people still believe in hitting children to enforce obedience, or that marriage to a 13-year-old is acceptable. The world evolves, but governments still want to operate as if it were the 1800s. Story 163. I will give my opinion. I like how the House of Representatives and the Senate are very different chambers. I would advocate a one-term limit in the Senate, a single 6-year term. A lot of the workload for members of Congress is fundraising and campaigning for re-election. This would reduce that. A sitting senator could campaign for their preferred replacement. I would advocate no term limits in the House of Representatives. I would like age limits for the Supreme Court of the United States. The situation where justices try to game their retirement depending on who is the president is problematic. It is also concerning how many justices die while still serving. Story 164. Against. People should be allowed to vote for whoever they want, regardless of how many terms a candidate has served. Story 165. There are term limits, and you cannot seek public office after age 70. Story 166. 2 terms for any elected federal position. Government appointees, whether judicial or bureaucratic, lose their appointment 3 terms after the official who appointed them leaves office unless the appointment is renewed. Story 167. What are your thoughts? Not just a single thought? I like the idea. Story 168. Term limits are a good idea. If a politician held a position in the House or Senate or served in the cabinet of an administration from the 1990s and is still active in either chamber, they should move on. However, right now it seems to be the younger members who are the issue, those aligned with Make America Great Again. The longer-serving members are mostly focused on keeping their skeletons hidden. Story 169. Yes to both. They cannot represent the people when they have spent their entire lives insulated from the daily struggles experienced by real, everyday Americans. Story 170. Implement term limits for every elected and appointed position. Set an age limit between 65 and 70. Ban stock trading, lobbying, and accepting bribes. These measures would fix many problems in this country. Story 171. Term limits and mandatory retirement ages are simplistic solutions to complicated problems. People like the idea because it is comforting to think we could fix the system with such a simple change. There are many ineffective or corrupt politicians who have been in Congress too long. But if they were limited by term or age, voters who elected them would probably replace them with equally objectionable newcomers. The newest members of Congress include many poor performers. Has the Republican Senate caucus improved since Mitch McConnell stepped down? Has the Democratic House caucus improved since Nancy Pelosi left leadership? Are the American people better served in Congress by John Fetterman than by Bernie Sanders? Does Lauren Boebert's relative youth make her any better than older colleagues? Many members of Congress have served for decades and accomplished important things for the country. These reforms would remove many inadequate politicians, but they would also force out experienced lawmakers and replace them with less experienced people who are easier for lobbyists to manipulate. Term and age limits would not fix the structural problems in our system of government. Ultimately, we need representatives who are less beholden to corporate interests and who are easier to replace at the ballot box when they perform poorly. At a minimum, this would require serious campaign finance reform, likely including public funding of elections, the end of gerrymandering to create safe districts, and vastly expanded and improved local news coverage of Congress. These fixes are complex and would require both congressional action and political will that we do not currently have, and they are not as simple for the public to understand as saying let us make a rule that older politicians must leave office. Story 172. Supreme Court justices should serve 10-year terms with mandatory retirement at age 70. Members of the House of Representatives and the Senate should be limited to 2 terms like the presidency. If a government shutdown lasts longer than 30 days, all seats in the House and Senate would be vacated and special elections held to replace everyone. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.